Hello, I'm Logan.
And I'm Lexi.
And this is Pride and Prejudice, the podcast talking all things pride, but mainly we're talking about the T in LGBT. Okay, so in this episode, we are talking about art versus artist. So essentially, can you separate the art from the person who created the art, or does that still create controversy? So we're of course going to cover J.K. Rowling, the internet's favourite transphobe. Graham Linehan, for those of you who don't know, he is he's a comedy writer. He wrote The IT Crowd, Black Books, I think Father Ted. Yeah. But it's not going to be all doom and gloom in this episode, because we're also going to talk about positive trans and LGBT allies. Okay, so J.K. Rowling, probably the most famous example that I can think of. It kind of started, there's better videos on YouTube highlighting the timeline of her rampant transphobia, but it basically started on Twitter when people pointed out that she was liking transphobic tweets, to which she responded, oh, silly me, I was having a middle-aged moment, no, I love trans people.
And now a few years on, she's not doing
Yeah. She went from saying, I'll march with you if you're being discriminated against, which is a weird thing to say because we are being discriminated against, to basically denying events in the Holocaust. So that's an interesting turn of events.
Yeah, she basically denied that, trans people were victimised at that time, which we were, well, not us, but people back then, especially in the first Nazi book burning, was actually literature from the Institute of Sexology, which included a lot of research on trans people.
Yeah, that's she says it's because she's pro-feminism, even though that's not really quite true. You're not a feminist if you don't support all women. Trans people are women.
Well,
no, not trans people are women. Oh no, what have I done? You're not a feminist if you don't support all women, and trans women are women. But also she's siding with activists who are anti-abortion, and then also very well-known misogynists, Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro, basically because they also agree on her views on trans people, but they are very against her views on feminism. So she's basically siding with anyone who will agree with her transphobia. So I don't really think it's about feminism. It's really just an excuse that she hides behind.
But I think there's this whole debate about, still consuming Harry Potter, supporting her books and even merchandise and things like that. But the thing is, at the moment, I mean, it's not like she's a thing of the past. She's still financially benefiting from that, and putting her money into anti-trans causes.
Yeah, and an interesting thing that she said is she considers anyone who buys her products to be supporters of her views, which is a weird thing to think, but just something to keep in mind if you do continue to buy anything that she will profit off. She thinks you're one of them. But I mean, you're allowed to enjoy Harry Potter, and you're allowed to enjoy the DVDs, books that you may have already owned pre-controversy, but if you continue to support her, it is going to have a negative effect on the trans community, because she will also use that money to donate to anti-trans causes and basically try and take our rights away. So it makes a bigger impact than most people think. Okay, so Graham Linehan, a very similar example, but I don't think he's quite as well known as J.K. Rowling's views. But what's interesting is that Graham Linehan did write an episode of The IT Crowd involving a trans woman, and then years later, people were kind of giving him backlash about this episode, to which he kind of responded back to it, and that's kind of what started this whole path of transphobia. And I'm not saying you can't have opinions, you know, like someone shouldn't get torn apart on the internet for their opinions, but it's not just an opinion. If you're speaking out against an entire group of people, you know, that's affecting people in a negative way. That's like, there's already a stigma towards trans people, and when you're adding to that and you have no research, like, I feel like most transphobia would just be solved if they would just talk to a trans person or do their own research. But
occasionally they'll look for a trans person who's kind of maybe more radical and might agree with some of their views, so that they can just find one person to agree with.
They agree with me. You know, it's like, I'm not racist, I have black friends. It's kind of the same, on the same wavelength as that. Yeah, it's very awkward. And there are people in every community that are negative towards their own community. For example, in the trans community, Blair White is kind of a conservative trans woman who says things that actively harm other trans women. She's very privileged to be able to pass and to be able to be in the position that she is, but she puts people down who aren't in the same situation as her. She gives people crap if they don't pass. So yeah, there are absolutely trans people who also negatively affect the community. I'm going to briefly mention Scott Cawthon as well. For those of you who don't know, he is a game developer. He did Five Nights at Freddy's, which was recently a movie. I'm only going to briefly mention him because he's not quite on the same level of harm as J.K. Rowling and Graham Linehan have caused. But it's more of a personal example of something that affected me, because I was never really a huge fan of Harry Potter, so I found that easy to sort of cut out of my life. IT Crowd and Black Books is a bit different. I do still enjoy them, but now I wouldn't buy a box set of them because it would mean supporting them. But Scott Cawthon, I'm quite attached to Five Nights at Freddy's as a series. It's kind of something I grew up with. And basically it sort of came out that he was donating to political parties that would negatively affect trans people. So
specific politicians, such as Donald Trump.
Which kind of went public on the internet, and people were saying like, oh, maybe his account got hacked, as there's no way that was him that did that. And then he came out and said, yeah, it was me. But what's confusing is that he's also donated to the Trevor Project, which is a positive charity towards LGBT people. So I do not understand what went on there. It's just very iffy. But I think it's important to mention because J.K. Rowling made her views very clear on trans people, you know, being very outwardly transphobic. But someone like Scott Cawthon, who's just kind of silently making negative sort of donations towards a group of people, like, that's bad as well, because you could unknowingly be supporting something or someone that's actively going against you. So let's talk about the negative effects that that these people have against the trans community. They're basically spreading misinformation, which gives people sort of, I don't want to say motivation to commit hate crime, but it's just sort of, oh, these famous people agree with me, so that must mean it's okay for me to treat this group of people in that way. I think you mentioned before that you were a Harry Potter fan growing up.
Yeah. Definitely kind of read all the books and saw the films when they came out, got the books when they came out. Even had books about Harry Potter as well. But I suppose it had already gone a bit off the rails by the time J.K. Rowling started being openly transphobic, so it was quite easy for me to drop in a way, although I have, you know, watched some of the films on TV when they've been on since, but it's kind of always in my mind then. especially she's done things like really recently, like donated to a campaign to try and change the definition of sex in the Equality Act to exclude trans people, even though trans people are protected under the Equality Act 2010, which, I mean, would negatively affect our everyday lives, basically.
Do we want to talk about that episode of It Crowd? Because it has since been removed from streaming services, and I don't think it airs on TV anymore. Do you remember much about that episode?
Yeah, I do remember watching it when it came out, and like I wasn't super offended by it or anything. It was just a silly joke. Not the best. Not the best wording that could have been used in the episode, but it didn't really offend me or anything. But obviously, you know, a few people felt a bit different, and Graham Linehan just took that completely the wrong way.
Yeah, that's the ironic thing. Like, when the controversy was coming out, I would have been like, oh, the episode wasn't that bad, because I still think it wasn't that bad. It just like was a bit. It could use some tweaking here and there. But then as soon as Graham Linehan comes out and says, oh yeah, I am transphobic, it's like, oh, well, now I know that episode has transphobic intent behind it, and then that changes the whole context of the thing. Basically, the plot of the episode is that one of the characters falls in love with a trans woman, to which she phrases it as, I used to be a man, which it isn't quite correct.
No, I mean, a few people, I think a few trans women might use that phrasing, but then a lot like me would say, well, I never was a man, or, you know, or they wouldn't just say I used to be a man anyway. I don't think, not in the way that happens in the episode.
Yeah, they cast a cis woman to play the trans character, which, in my opinion, is better than casting a cis man. But would also be nice to have trans women playing trans women in media. But basically, the episode goes that she says, "I used to be a man." The guy falls in love with her. She likes very typically masculine things, you know, like darts, beard. She's better at arm wrestling than him, which kind of falls into stereotypes, but it's not really the worst thing in the world. And then at the end of the episode, she says, he says, oh, to think that you were worried because you used to come from Iran. And then she's like, no, that's not what I said. I said I used to be a man. And then he was like, oh. And then he breaks up with her. But then at the end of the episode, he realizes that he's miserable because he misses her. And it kind of implies that it was a mistake on his part to break up with her, even though he very clearly liked her. So it's almost a positive trans message, sort of, in a way. But yeah, Graham Linehan really went off on one talking about cancel culture, which is a whole other can of worms. It's not, you know, it's called consequences, you know. Freedom, what's it called?
Freedom of speech.
Yeah, freedom of speech is not freedom of consequences. Okay, so that's a lot of bad apples in one take. Let's talk about some positive allies. Do you want to lead with David Tennant, because you sort of have seen more stuff in with him than I have?
Yeah, I mean, David Tennant, I know, I think one of his children is trans or non-binary, so he's kind of quite a vocal ally. And you'll see him. I think he had a T-shirt on one time that said, "Leave trans kids alone, you absolute freaks," or something like that. And he's worn kind of trans pins and things like that. But certainly, I mean, I've never got any bad vibes from him anyway. I've seen him in a lot of stuff, and yeah, it's nice to see someone like that, particularly. Like last year, for example, when he was in Doctor Who again, and in Good Omens, and he was popping up all over the place, and just kind of, yeah, you got to see that, just turn the TV on and he's there with his little trans pin on. It's quite nice.
Yeah, I've always liked him as a performer. I haven't seen nearly as much Doctor Who as Lexi has, but when I was growing up, he was the Doctor, so he's who I think of first when I think of Doctor Who. But I think I've liked him in every single thing I've seen him in. And then when he came out as a trans ally and was doing these openly pro-trans things, even the little things like wearing the pin badges, I was like, well, now I like him even more. But Neil Gaiman is an interesting example because, David Tennant is a pro-trans actor, but Neil Gaiman is a pro-LGBT writer, which means he can actively make better representation for these groups of people, and he has done for years.
Yeah, I mean, some of the earliest Neil Gaiman stuff that I've read is the Sandman comics that started in the late 80s and through the 90s. And I remember reading, I think in the second kind of story arc or the third one, I can't remember, he had a character called Wanda who was she's a trans character, but she wasn't really a stereotype. I mean, there's valid criticism of her character, but I think that was like the first trans character that I read in comics, and I've read a lot of comics, and that was really nice. Just to see that, basically, and to see this defiant trans woman. And he's done a lot of stuff since as well, with sexuality and gender in his characters.
Yeah, it's interesting when the Sandman Netflix series came out, there was some, I don't want to say controversial, because it isn't controversial, people just made it controversial, about who was cast for what characters. They had a black woman playing Death, who canonically has been black before, right? They can change forms. Yeah. And it's saying like, oh, it's gone woke. It's like, did you read the comics?
Yeah, so Desire in the Netflix show is played by a non-binary actor, but then Desire, the character, has kind of always been non-binary in the comics as well. So what is even the difference? That's a completely appropriate casting.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes people just want an excuse to be mad, and they clearly haven't seen enough of the original source material if they think that these are changes to the material. And even if they are changes, like, it's an adaptation, you're allowed to make changes, you know.
Yeah, I think like in Good Omens, which was the original book, was co-written by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, and when Neil Gaiman worked on the TV series, he kind of ended up with the two main characters kind of getting together, which I don't think, maybe it was hinted at in the book, but it's kind of made progress with that in the actual show.
So having these negative celebrity influences can be generally harmful. And what they don't realise is that they're also excluding a good chunk of their audience. Like, I can imagine so many trans Harry Potter fans must have been absolutely heartbroken to see that someone they potentially looked up to just hates their existence. You know, that's a really soul-crushing revelation to have. So to have these positive celebrities coming out and saying, no, screw it, I am supporting this group of people, say what you want, you know, it really does make a difference more than people think it might. Sometimes, because Lexi and I have these conversations occasionally about, sometimes one of us has found out that someone we looked up to has views that negatively go against us, and then I get really depressed thinking, oh, who else, you know, who else do I like actively hates my existence? And then Lexi sort of reminds me that people like David Tennant and Neil Gaiman exist, but also people who aren't just allies, people who are part of the community, Elliot Page and Susie Izzard. Coming out as trans while being a celebrity must be a whole can of worms, because everyone knows your dead name, and the wrong people will use that against you. But to sort of come out and be like, I'm gonna be myself no matter what audience members I might lose. It's a really strong thing to do, and it's inspiring to see as a trans person to think, well, if this celebrity can do it, then maybe I can do it too.
Thanks for listening to the Pride and Prejudice podcast.
And be sure to check out the other episodes.
Bye.
Bye.